Welcome to the show. You are listening to Slick Talk, and I'm your host, Blackstone Joe. Today's episode is titled Coolin' Down. Whatever the title may suggest, we're not here to relax. We're here to get down to business. The serious business of analyzing coolant, aka antifreeze. For those that aren't entirely clear on what we're talking about, antifreeze is what you need to protect an engine from overheating. Now, why would a coolant sample be useful? Well, that's a worthwhile question, given that I'm betting most of our listeners don't assume that we would analyze coolant. Most of what we're doing at the lab is analyzing petroleum-based substances, and in a perfect world, petroleum is never going to come into contact with coolant. However, there are other characteristics, other properties of coolant that you want to analyze in order to determine whether or not it should be in use. So, in order to illustrate our testing and what sort of things can go wrong with coolant, I brought with me a few, I would say, interesting examples that spotlight typical issues as well as an instance where everything looks good. So you have an idea of what an ideal sample of coolant will look like when it's made the rounds. First up, I have a sample where we immediately started the comment with the coolant should not be in use. And I want to pause right there just to let you know that if you send us a sample of coolant, or if you're sending us a sample of really anything that we can analyze and you haven't changed it yet, if you make that explicit, we'll be sure to mention whether or not it should stay in use. But if it's an instance like coolant where we aren't quite sure whether or not you've changed it, we'll still be sure to offer a recommendation, because you don't want to leave coolant in use if it's not serviceable for any variety of factors. The issue with this particular sample was the freeze point. So if you're not familiar, you want to have a proper ratio of water to glycol. This particular sample had a freeze point that was much too high. As such, we were going to suggest a flush based on this finding alone. However, that's not where the analysis stopped. We also looked for the presence of nitrites, the presence of petroleum-based contamination, specific gravity, and the pH. Now, if you're not familiar with the pH, that's going to tell us how acidic the coolant is. You want a coolant that is on the basic side. So if a coolant is overly acidic, that would be another reason to change it. In this case, there wasn't any petroleum-based contamination. Specific gravity checked out. Nitrites, we didn't find any, and that's okay. They are not present in every variety of coolant. But here, the improper freeze point was reason to change the coolant, and we let the customer know that right away. Something I always want our customers to be mindful of. We will never tell you or attempt to leave ambiguity as far as what you need to do with that coolant. There will be a you should change it or it can stay in use, because we know that that is typically what you need to know. It's pretty rare for folks to send us a sample of coolant that they've already changed out. Generally, they're looking for insight into whether or not they should change it. Next up, we have a sample where we suggested flushing the coolant, and that is because of the presence of oil in the sample. It was a relatively minor amount. We're looking at a range of 5 to 100 parts per million. And for perspective, that is the smallest amount of petroleum-based contamination we're going to be able to identify. It's going to be hard to spot with the naked eye, which is why we will use a test strip to identify the presence of hydrocarbons. And despite the fact this is a minor amount, it's still reason to change the coolant. Hydrocarbons can continue to accumulate and keep the coolant from doing its job. We're not able to determine how long it's taken this contamination to reach the coolant, so it's possible this is the most minor of issues, and maybe it wouldn't cause a problem at this level, but we can't really worry about factors that are beyond the scope of analysis, in the sense that if you have oil in the coolant, it shouldn't be there. It's a reason to flush it. It's a reason to look into why it's getting in there. As for how long you can let that ride, it's just going to be hard to know for sure. So best practice is to change it if we find hydrocarbons present. Otherwise, the coolant looked fine in testing. And as far as determining where the oil was coming into contact with the coolant, like how it was able to reach the coolant reservoir, we did offer a suggestion specifically to pressure test the cooling system. So that way you can at least gain some insight into where the problem is occurring. Now, other than hydrocarbons, we didn't find anything that looked like a concern. The pH wasn't overly acidic, freeze point checked out, specific gravity as well. We weren't looking at anything abnormal, and even with the petroleum-based contamination that was there, it's such a small amount that a spectral analysis didn't reveal much as far as, what this oil looked like. It's not an instance where, you send us a 3-ounce bottle of oil, and then we're able to see, the classic lineup, the additive levels that are in the thousands. It's not an instance where it's going to be all that clear. Remember, we're talking about just 5 to 100 parts per million, very minor. Still, reason to change the coolant. So already we've unpacked a couple of issues that are fairly common to come across and reason to analyze coolant. This is a test that it wouldn't shock me if most people assumed we didn't test coolant because, mainly we're all about oil around here, but we can analyze it, and you want to be on the lookout for issues like that improper mix of water to glycol or the presence of oil. Next up, we had a coolant sample, which thankfully didn't have any troubling finds. And in addition to the tests I've already broken down, I want to stress that we're looking for a couple of visual characteristics as well. So there are a couple things you can determine simply with the eye test if you are doing this on your own. And we're going to be looking for these characteristics as well, namely the presence of visible debris, and also you want to have a coolant that's typically clear and bright. That's industry speak for how coolant should be. The appearance, you should be able to see through it pretty easily. If you have a coolant that is very cloudy, dark, hard to see through, or if there is a lot of sediment or debris, these are both no-nos as well, but I can understand if you want to take it beyond these visual characteristics and break down things like the freeze point, the specific gravity. Obviously, every factor I've discussed is important, which is why we add it to the report. But on your end, you can also be checking for things like debris, sediment, and you want to have that clear and bright appearance. Now, if you have a coolant where everything checks out, but it's not necessarily clear and bright, you might be able to get away with leaving that coolant in use, but it's still something that you want to look for. It is a hallmark of coolant that is in serviceable condition. So we want to take into account the visual appearance as well. The last one I want to break down today. So this is a sample where no problem stood out. We have test results that are across the board favorable, and also a visual inspection didn't reveal any issues in the form of sediment, debris, or appearance. So that brings my coolant discussion to a close, but I'm not quite done yet. First of all, I want to remind our listeners, especially if you aren't aware yet, we just released another video titled Kit Building with Heather. This is on our Instagram, it's on our YouTube, and it kind of continues this series where I want to give a look behind the curtain, not just a listen that you get with the podcast, but also a look behind the curtain of Blackstone Laboratories, how we run our operations, what sets us apart, and Heather, along with the rest of our kit building team, is one of those special ingredients that makes Blackstone what it is. She was kind enough to help us make the video, provide a voiceover. That way you don't have to keep on listening to yours truly. If you want to get a break, you can listen to Heather narrate this video, break down what goes into kit building. It's such a crucial step in the process, one that obviously you all can assume happens because when you send a kit, someone had to build it. But I still think it is insightful and gives you a chance to meet another person on the team. So Heather was kind enough to let us step in and do some filming of her process, as well as sit down with us and break down what goes into kit building. It was a video we had a blast working on, myself and my co-producer Josh. So please do head over to our YouTube page or Instagram, check out the kit building video. with Heather. Obviously, a like and thumbs up is appreciated, but you can also leave a comment to let us know what other parts of the Blackstone operation you would like to gain more information on. We're not done. We're going to keep spotlighting lab tests as well as just kind of how we run things from samples coming in the door to the report going out. We're going to continue to do that, but as far as the order in which we do it, that can be a little dependent on what you would like to see, what you would like to hear. So leave some feedback as far as what you would like next, and we'll do our best to adjust our production schedule like so. And lastly, I want to return to our survey questions because I mentioned I was going to leave our survey open, specifically the survey asking about episode content, what you would like to see more of from Slick Talk. So if you don't know anything about this survey link, it is in our bio on our Instagram page. And I'm leaving it live because I want to let you leave some topic suggestions, some quick questions that I can incorporate into an episode. Some of them I'm going to need, a whole episode to build out the content. But in this particular instance, I have one that I was able to read and immediately know I can break it down for you during this episode. So that's what I'm going to do today. And that is the question, what are the differences between race oil and normal oil for gasoline engines? And the differences really stand out in the additive levels. You'll see a very stout additive package typically, and especially in the anti-wear elements like phosphorus and zinc. But some oils, though, really beef up like the molybdenum level. And molybdenum is also in there for anti-wear purposes. So a race oil will often look kind of like a break-in oil for most cars in terms of having a lot of additive there, especially for anti-wear purposes. You'll see it especially in like red line oils, oils that have, well into the thousands of ppm, maybe even of molybdenum. And then you also have a lot of phosphorus and zinc, which you might think of differently in the term ZDDP. So you can expect a lot of additive there. Like I said, mainly for anti-wear purposes. The oil might also tend to run thicker in terms of viscosity, but otherwise, there's not a whole lot of differences. You're going to have all the additive you need. Most of those oils tend to be on the thicker side, and that's really about it as far as how they look in comparison to like if you were just to pick up, a Mobil 1 530 off the shelf. You're going to see a lot more additive in there, and it's meant to be there for typically anti-wear purposes. And sort of adjacent to the first question, we had another one come in asking about engine oil and how it's affected by track use. So comparing race oil to normal oil and also how race oil can be affected, I thought it made sense to kind of join these two together. So there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to this question, which I'm glad there's not, because it wouldn't do a lot of good for people who, say they do 2,000 miles of, street driving and then they incorporate 5 track days and that's their oil change interval compared to someone who's strictly doing track days. So there's not an across-the-board interval. Similarly, we don't have a preferred interval that you would provide if you are, a dedicated track driver. So if you are someone who is starting their oil analysis program, what I would do is send in a baseline sample with your garden variety use. If that is 5 track days, go with it. If that is 5 track days and 1,000 miles, the point is we want to get a look at what's typical for you starting out. And then what we can do is we can tailor our recommendations based on what we're finding in your baseline sample. So if you have a sample with 5 track days, and maybe that's not a lot of use, and as such, metals might be low, mainly due to a short oil run, we're not seeing any other issues, well, then we can extend the oil change interval, allow a bit more time for metals to accumulate. So we might stretch you out to 10 track days, or maybe we'll want to see an oil run with 1,000 miles added if you are in the business of street driving as well as track use. Give us that typical interval, or if you want to go with like a shop recommendation, if you have recently, added new parts, a rebuild, give us a look at what you are typically asking of the vehicle. And then let us step in and recommend if we're seeing the need for shorter or longer intervals I'm sure all the drivers out there know that one person's idea of autocross use and what's typical is going to be wildly different from another's. Also, this can be very dependent on builders. What they've been told is suggested. Some people are going to be really strict with manufacturer guidelines. There's simply so many voices in the conversation when you are getting into maintenance plans that it's not terribly helpful to have an across-the-board recommendation. We make these interval suggestions unique to what we're seeing in the results, and everyone's going to have different needs. Some people are going to be sampling one engine, but they've added significant amounts of power. It's asking more of oil sharing parts. And then some people are going to be sampling that same engine totally stock, and as such, the engine's wear profile might look a whole lot more like average. And then you have that same owner with the same car, but they've done so many different things that their wear profile is going to normally be different. And then obviously you have that last category where we might want to monitor potential problems or we're identifying contaminants, etc. So start your oil analysis program and allow us to build out the ideal plan for you. And that way you know that you're getting recommendations not just based on this gray area, but rather detailed data points, trends, where we are taking a look at how the engine's responding to the use it sees. That's all for episode 62. Thanks so much for hanging with us, participating in the surveys. Don't forget to check out our new video with Heather on Instagram and on our YouTube page. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off. And also, a visual inspection didn't reveal any issues in the form of sediment, debris, or appearance. Jerry, knock it off. This is what happens when I record the podcast and Cheyenne's not home and Jerry is left to his own devices.